Well, hello, everyone. I'm Eugene Goltz. I'm a professor at the LBJ School next door, and I co-organized this series for the Robert S. Strauss Center on International Security and Law, our International Security Speaker Series. I'd like to welcome you all here, and very pleased to have you here for what I think is going to be a very interesting talk. Before I introduce Tim, I would like to thank our generous co-sponsors at the LBJ Presidential Library, Betty Sue Flowers, and for this lovely room. And it's particularly resonant with this talk, as I'll explain in just a moment. But I think that's great. And I would like to tell you about our fifth talk of the spring semester, which will be coming up next week on April the 10th. We'll have Philip Zelikow speaking here at 5 o'clock on something about globalization. I'm sorry, I can't remember the title. It's really embarrassing. But Philip Zelikow is going to give a great talk next week, and it will enlighten us all. And it is on the Strauss Center website, the advertising for it. So please check that out. Tonight, though, we have a great speaker. I've already had people from the audience coming up to tell me that they've seen Tim before on TV, on star DVDs of great lecturers in presidential history.
I don't know about.
He's going to be brilliant, and I know he's going to be brilliant. I've known Tim actually for many years. He's now soared to new heights as the director of the Nixon Presidential Library, which is why it's particularly resonant that he's giving a talk at the LBJ Presidential Library. And I don't need any particular connection between LBJ and Nixon in that context. But Tim actually does also have a personal LBJ connection in that he is the general editor of the LBJ Tapes Project. So I guess volumes 4, 5, and 6 have just come out. We looked for them downstairs. Volumes 1, 2, and 3 are down there. You can purchase them in the museum store. You can learn everything that happened in the LBJ administration that's on the tapes downstairs by reading those books. And Tim is the general editor, which is great. Tim is a wonderful scholar beyond that, too. He's written a number of books, including his new book about President George H.W. Bush, which is what he'll be speaking about today. But he's written on the Soviet Union, U.S.-Soviet relations, and intelligence issues, or intelligence and counterintelligence issues. Very learned. I've learned much from talking to Tim over the years, but I've also known him in many other contexts. He shot me with a paintball, and there are not many speakers who've done that. And
you were slow, Eugene.
I guess, yeah. But I don't think there are going to be any paintballs in today's discussion. I think we hope not. But without further babbling, let's welcome Tim Naftali.
First of all, Eugene, it's a pleasure to see you. And I'm not going to shoot any paintballs at you.
Thank you.
Unless your name is George W. Bush. And, of course, Betty Sue, I appreciate your participation, and I'm grateful to the Strauss Center. It's particularly delightful for someone who at the moment is the Nixon Library Director to be speaking about George Bush in the LBJ Library. I remember when Arthur Schlesinger asked me why I wanted to do this book. In the book, I actually only have half of that conversation, a quarter, because I don't think it would help the book's sales if I told the entire conversation. But Arthur Schlesinger asked me, well, Tim, do you really want to write about George Bush? And that's what's in the book. And then there was another sentence where he said, he's so boring. And I wanted to look at two questions. I remember the 1992 campaign. I remember jumping for joy. I was in graduate school, just finishing graduate school in 1992, and jumping for joy when Ohio went to Clinton. I remember the sense of fatigue that many Americans had with Republican administrations, but particularly with George Bush. I remember the sad moment, the vomiting moment in Tokyo, which seemed actually symptomatic of a weak, tired, ill administration. Time for change, no vision. And that's what I remember of the period. But there were two very interesting questions that came to mind later, a decade later. The first question had to do with my own reading in Cold War history. I had become disappointed in the kinds of writing that I was seeing on the end of the Cold War. It seemed to me there were two camps. There were the American triumphalist camp, who were arguing that Ronald Reagan ended the Cold War. And then there was a camp that I was much more comfortable with, which is sort of the Gorbachev did it camp, which was looking at sort of internal dynamics in the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union losing gas, running out of gas. And that sort of made sense to me, but having spent some time writing about Khrushchev and his relationship with Kennedy, I'd come to a deep appreciation of the role of Berlin in the Soviet psyche and the extent to which Soviet leaders viewed their occupation of Germany as really their claim to great powerdom. And so the fact that somehow Germany was reunified in the context of NATO during the Bush administration struck me as very interesting and worthy of study. Philip Zelikow, who's going to be speaking here, is it next week? And Condi Rice, whom you've all heard of too, wrote an interesting book about the reunification of Germany. It was a policy history, and it's very much worth reading. But besides that book, I hadn't seen enough people who sat back and thought, this was truly remarkable and not predictable. Again, those of you who are old enough to remember that period, 89 through 91, there seemed to be a certain inevitability. Countries becoming free, or at least throwing off the shackles of Soviet power, having elections, forming pro-Western governments, pro-American governments, the Soviets appearing to agree to things that they had never agreed to, on-site inspection, the destruction of weapons, unified Germany, the list goes on. And there seemed to be an inevitability to it. But as historians, we actually know that great things like that are not inevitable. And so there had to be a process at work, which I wanted to understand a little bit better. And it seemed to me one of the ways to get at this question was to wonder about the leadership of the cipher, of the man who's known as an asterisk, the footnote, the third term of Ronald Reagan, George Bush. And there was something else that had happened in the 10 years since the election of 1992. His son had become president. And having watched the run-up to the Iraq War, I wondered how the same or similar genetic pool could have produced two very different responses to the threat posed by Saddam Hussein. What was it about Daddy that made him so different from the son? And that's what led me to tackle this question. Now, again, he would prove to be a surprise. Today, you may have noticed, I saw it on CNN. Doesn't mean it's true, but I saw it on CNN. John McCain has narrowed his prospective vice presidential candidates to 20. It's not really narrowing. If anybody knows something about vice presidential choices, what you do when you're choosing a vice president is you make a lot of people happy by saying that you're thinking of them. You're not really thinking of them, but you want to make them happy. And they like it. They know they're not being thought of either, but it's good for their future careers to have been thought of. George Bush, Daddy Bush, was a master at being thought of as a vice president years before he actually became one. But it made me think about a story of how George Bush chose his vice president and how the choice of Dan Quayle is so revealing of all the negative attributes of George Bush. And if all you knew about George Bush was the manner in which he campaigned, and since I'm in the LBJ Library and I'm in Texas, I want to talk about that. But if all you knew about George Bush was the way he had campaigned, largely unsuccessfully for public office, before chosen by Ronald Reagan, and the way he ultimately chose Dan Quayle as his running mate, you would have very low expectations for him as a president. Now, how did he choose Dan Quayle? George Bush was and is, he's alive, of course, was very secretive in the way in which he made decisions. He listened to his advisors. He listened hard. He's very good, actually, at listening. And then he would go alone and make up his mind. Because the wimp slander was a chip on his shoulder throughout his life. You can go back in his diaries, and even after his moment of heroism in the Pacific War, he's writing letters to his parents saying how weak he was, how sad it was that his two crewmates did not survive, how he should have done more. And this is actually, if again, there's enough of his diaries that are in the public domain that you can see this as a constant theme in his life, his own inability to live up to his own ideal of manhood. So he likes to make decisions on his own, and he likes to surprise people to show that he's in control. His key advisors were surprised when he chose Dan Quayle. His closest advisor, James Baker, hated the idea of Dan Quayle being selected. In fact, tried to argue George Bush out of selecting Dan Quayle. But George Bush, once he made up his mind, was resolute. Now, why did he choose Dan Quayle? Some of his closest advisors say that he chose Dan Quayle because just 2 days before he had seen Dan Quayle on Meet the Press defending him very well. Others, and I side with this camp, believe that he saw in Dan Quayle himself. George Bush had been a young man, a comer, if you will, a young man in a hurry, an attractive young man in the 60s in Texas politics. He was being touted for national office when he hadn't even won a single Texas race. He was because he was attractive, he was energetic, he always looked younger than his years, and he was a master at the kind of feel-good politics that people without substance, I don't say he's not with substance, but he ran as someone without substance, tend to choose as the way forward. He saw this in Dan Quayle. Dan Quayle had taken on a long-serving Democratic senator named Birch Bayh and had beaten him. It was a big deal. It was an upset. Dan Quayle was not known for having a lot of substance. He was very good-looking and energetic and seemed to be the future of his party. And George Bush, in a sense, was choosing a mini-me when he chose Dan Quayle. Now, he didn't tell his advisors that Quayle was the nominee until he arrived in New Orleans for the convention. And that was a near disaster. Some of you, again, may remember scenes of Dan Quayle looking like he was a deer caught in the headlights when he was brought forward onto the stage in New Orleans and introduced to the American people, to the world, by George Bush. Dan Quayle was so surprised that he was chosen that he actually hugged George Bush and then gave him a little punch in the arm, which looked terribly awkward. He also was not very good at answering questions about his own service, or lack thereof, in Vietnam. There had been no preparation. The way in which George Bush had made this decision had made it impossible for the Bush team to prepare Dan Quayle or to prepare the scene the way that Ronald Reagan had always prepared it, the way that Mike Deaver had been master of creating an image. But George Bush's particular and peculiar decision-making style made that very hard to achieve, and the results in the summer of 1988 in New Orleans were nearly disastrous. The night that Quayle was chosen, the night after, or the evening after he was publicly announced, George Bush had to throw together, the campaign had to throw together a team led by Richard Darman, a recently deceased, later head of the OMB, to figure out Dan Quayle's background. Had he actually used cocaine? People were talking about that. What indeed had he done in the National Guard? How did he get into the Guard? Why didn't he go to Vietnam? None of these questions had been answered by the campaign before the selection was announced. It was as bad as something that happened in 1972 to a man named George McGovern when he had selected Thomas Eagleton without knowing that he had a background. He had had some bouts of mental illness. If that was all you knew about George Bush's management style, the presidency would have been a disaster. And yet, as I will argue today, in foreign policy, it wasn't a disaster. And I'd like to tease out for you some of the reasons why. And then at the end in the Q&A, we can talk about the implications as we think about the next president, whoever that happens to be. Over 10 years ago, in the place where Aggies roam, a governor of Texas, George W. Bush, gave a speech at the opening of his father's library. And in that speech he said, my father will be looked unfavorably by historians. His reputation will grow as historians study him. Little did younger George W. Bush know that it would largely be because of his mistakes as president that his father's historical reputation 10 years later would rise. But there are a number of reasons why we should look at the father. More than 20 years ago, John Lewis Gaddis wrote a book entitled Strategies of Containment. And he argued that there were basically two approaches to fighting the Cold War. One that seemed to ascribe unlimited resources to the problem, and another that was more cautious or circumspect. Although it was overgeneralized at the margins, the book was a very smart way, in my estimation, to compare and contrast how presidential administrations manage this country's largest foreign policy challenges. 2 decades later, we use code words like neocon, or realist, or idealist, reality-based, or faith-based to get at the fact that presidencies manage foreign challenges differently. Sometimes they do this because of an intense desire to differentiate themselves from the president before them, sometimes because of the domestic politics of the era, and sometimes because of the character of the individual president and his ideas. Now, historians love thick description, and I am no exception. But what I hope will emerge from my talk is a theme of realism in power. This is not a story of unalloyed success. History, faithfully told, rarely is. This is also not the story of realism with relish. Americans, as I will argue, are traditionally reluctant realists, and Bush 41 was well within that tradition. In the first part, I will discuss the key decisions that Bush made regarding the two principal foreign policy challenges that he faced: the end of the Cold War and fighting the Gulf War. And I will also examine their consequences. And in the time remaining, I'll try to put the Bushian realism in context. If you think about how empires disappear, it is rare for grand empires to go out of business peacefully. The fact that the Cold War ended relatively peacefully, with few lives lost and comparatively little global upheaval, is significant. Consider for a moment the collapse of the Belgian Empire, the horrors of the Congo, the collapse of the Portuguese Empire, the horrors of Angola, let alone that of the French Empire, Indochina, Algeria, and later Chad. Even the comparatively poised retreat of the British brought millions of deaths in the Indian subcontinent, in Nigeria, and some troubles in a place called Palestine. George Bush, I would argue, deserves as much credit as Mikhail Gorbachev for the peaceful collapse of the Soviet Empire and the resulting soft landing of the Cold War. But he doesn't get credit for it. And one of the reasons he doesn't get credit for it is the fact that for 9 months in 1989, George Bush seemed to stumble out of the gate as president. There is a now forgotten debate that took place between realists and Reaganites at the end of the Reagan administration. It's actually quite fascinating in retrospect. After 1986, Ronald Reagan and George Shultz worked together to pocket the gains from Gorbachev's progressivism. They worked closely with Gorbachev. It was clear that a personal relationship had developed between President Reagan and Gorbachev. And the whole tenor of the relationship began to shift from enemy to adversary, and it seemed possibly to friend. The most significant achievement of that last period of the Reagan era was the INF Treaty. Now, the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, is relevant to this discussion for one very significant reason. Again, it's something that comes from having looked at Soviet history. Soviets never wanted on-site inspection. It's funny, I was working on this book about Khrushchev when we had this debate about Saddam Hussein, and people didn't seem to understand that dictators like to lie about WMD. Very few dictators will admit how weak they are. Remember how a dictator becomes a dictator. They're not elected. They're not used to having strong institutions outside themselves. Their strongest institution is their own credibility. And that usually is derived from play, if you will, from the soccer field bully approach to power. So these kinds of people have no interest in admitting that they're weaker than they are. Khrushchev understood this, as did Brezhnev. And the way that they got around the fact that they understood American power was greater was that they always lied about Soviet power. And they knew about it. We now have the minutes of the Politburo for the entire Khrushchev period, and we have a few from the Brezhnev period. And it's clear that they know how weak they are. It's just that we don't. But in order to maintain the ruse of Soviet power, they had to deny us the ability to really spy effectively, which is the reason why when Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s offered something called the Open Skies proposal, which was to basically open our skies, let the Soviets fly. This was before the spy planes were developed. Fly over our country, see where our bases were, count our bombers. In those days, that's really what mattered most. This was before the missile was developed. And, of course, in return, the Soviets would open their skies. Well, the Soviet military in the 1950s wanted to accept this proposal. And as we now know, Khrushchev said, "Are you crazy? The minute they start flying over our territory, they'll know how weak we are, and then they'll launch an attack." When Gorbachev came to power, he was the first Soviet leader ever to accept on-site inspection, basically undermining the basic Soviet approach to power in the international system. Because from that moment on, the Soviets could no longer successfully lie about their nuclear force, which meant they were no longer viewing their relationship with us as a military contest. That took place under Reagan. Realists, and by realists I mean Brent Scowcroft, Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon, and to a certain extent then George Bush, were doubtful that Ronald Reagan was right about Gorbachev. George Bush argued, as we now know from the Reagan diaries, against the INF Treaty, saying that it was a giveaway, that we needed more. We should keep some of our intermediate range missiles. Let them keep some in Siberia, and we'll keep some here. Even more vociferous was the opposition from Kissinger in the New York Times, Scowcroft a little bit more quietly, and then Richard Nixon to his allies. The argument they made was that the Reaganites were romantics. They were idealists. They had fallen in love with Gorby. And as a result, they were allowing Gorbachev to if you will, to weaken American defenses and American resolve without enough changes in the facts on the ground. And what were the changes they wanted on the ground? Those were changes in Eastern Europe. The realists argued that the Cold War was in Eastern Europe, and the only way to end the Cold War was for the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe to become free. Now, by 1988, that hadn't happened yet. And so George Bush comes into power with a team that is skeptical of Reagan's policy towards Gorbachev and Reagan's embrace of Gorbachev. For the first 9 months of the Bush administration, Brent Scowcroft, who's National Security Advisor, leads a review of U.S. policy towards the Soviet Union and basically freezes policy towards the Soviet Union. In fact, there's real dramatic similarity between what the first Bush administration did with regard to the Soviet Union and what the second Bush administration did with regard to Central Asia and terrorism. Because the second Bush administration froze this issue for 9 months and was actually about to discuss it with a man named Richard Clarke when 9/11 happened. So the coming out of the starting gate, the Bush administration, Daddy Bush, stumbles with regard to Gorby. Doesn't stumble with regard to everything. In fact, having gone through the Iran-Contra scandal, the administration very quickly comes up with a sound policy towards Nicaragua, stops focusing on paramilitary operations of the Contras and starts thinking about ways of encouraging direct elections, which becomes the U.S. policy. It was a very smart thing to do. But with regard to Gorby, it's not until Bush takes a trip to Eastern Europe in the summer of '89 and sees for himself by meeting Democrats in Poland that there is a change afoot. And so by the fall of 1989, just at the time that the change occurs in Hungary, and then the change, of course, the famous one occurs in Berlin, Bush realizes, oh my God, I'm behind the 8 ball. I have to move faster. And I argue in the book that between the end of 1989 and the end of the Gulf War in 1991, for 2 years, the Bush administration shows about the best you can see in American foreign policy making. Doesn't last very long, but it's 2 years of remarkable decision making. And let's talk about what it was. The first evidence of this decision making comes the night that the Berlin Wall falls. Again, some of you will remember that. It was astounding. It was an astounding moment. There were many people who looked to President Bush to give the day, a final eloquent note, much in the way that Ronald Reagan had made our grief a little less heavy after the Challenger disaster. But George Bush was incapable of that kind of eloquence. That's how it was always described. In fact, it was a calculated decision by George Bush not to even attempt eloquence that night. And what he said privately, and then would later say in a letter to Gorbachev, was, there is pressure on me to dance on the wall tonight. But it is not in the interest of the United States to rub your nose in what must be a difficult moment for your country. What Bush began to understand, and I'll explain to you why I think it's Bush and not one of his advisors pushing him, began to understand was something that our greatest presidents understood with time. It's something that John F. Kennedy understood after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's something that Dwight Eisenhower understood. It's something that Lyndon Johnson understood, which is that Soviet leaders look to save face, and that reputation matters in international politics, and that being a good winner is a very important skill. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have this on tape, after all, John Kennedy told his advisors, do not celebrate our victory. We don't know what kind of reaction Khrushchev's opponents in the Politburo might have. Bush made the same call, and it was the right one. He wrote to Gorby. He wanted to meet Gorby. In the summer of 1989, he wanted to meet Gorby. They were both busy, and so they don't meet until the Nausea Summit in Malta of 1989, where they were supposed to go back and forth on these 2 boats, but the weather was apparently unusually bad. The Maltese, I guess who would know their own weather, said that it was the worst that it had been in centuries. I kept thinking of a falcon. But anyway, they both got sick. But in their few meetings, Bush promised Gorby that the United States would begin to rethink its economic relationship to the Soviet Union, which after all was what Gorby really was after. If Gorby adopted a nonviolent approach to self-determination in the former Soviet Union, Bush was thinking about the Baltic states. In particular, he was thinking about Lithuania. The United States had never recognized the incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. But the Baltic states were a much harder case for Gorby than even East Germany was. And it was clear, though, that the democratic movement that we were seeing in Eastern Europe was spreading to the Baltic states. So at Malta, Bush tried to explain that there was going to be a relationship, there was going to be linkage between Soviet behavior in the Baltic states and our government's willingness to make the Soviets part of our international trading order. Bush also began to talk to Gorby about German reunification. Bush was ahead of all of his advisors, and they all testify to this, in thinking that a reunified Germany could actually be brought into NATO with Soviet approval. Scowcroft didn't think it was possible. Dick Cheney, who was defense secretary, didn't think it was possible. James Baker wasn't sure it was possible. Bush felt it should be the objective of the United States. Of course, there was a German who thought it was possible, Kohl. Helmut Kohl believed this could be done. But the fact that Bush allied himself with Kohl from the beginning was very significant for the way in which American policy would be shaped in 1990. So what happens? I'm not going to go through the chronology of the Baltic crisis, but I am going to tell you about the end point. Lithuania declares independence. The Soviets begin to mistreat Lithuanians. They begin to track down Lithuanians who are not showing up, who are deserting the Soviet army. There is enormous political pressure on Bush to decry what's going on and to make Gorbachev pay a price for what seems to be a different policy from what he had followed in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and East Germany. Bush doesn't do it. Bush refuses to put too much pressure on Gorbachev in the spring of 1990. He is Vytautas Landsbergis, the leader of the Lithuanian, democracy, the leader of the Lithuanian independence movement, calls Bush the Neville Chamberlain of his time. Right-wing and some left-wing correspondents in our country decry his lack of commitment to freedom. But again, we have his own internal notes and the recollections of his advisors. He was telling people, we can't push Gorby too far. We have to keep him in power. He is moving in our direction. And in fact, he has let loose processes that even he cannot control. And I think if we are patient, we will get a unified Germany and NATO. But if we go hard against him now, either he will turn hard against Germany or he will be displaced by someone we don't know. And the outcome would be worse for us. It was a calculated, phased policy of basically eating political prestige at home and taking great hits and being called a wimp and all of the things that George Bush hated to be called in return for a modulated policy of carrots and sticks to help Gorbachev get to that point where he could accept a unified Germany and NATO. And it happens. In May of 1990, Bush turns to Gorby, or actually early June, Bush turns to Gorby and says, would you accept self-determination for Germans? And Gorby says, of course, I accept self-determination for all the peoples of Europe. And if by self-determination the Germans choose to join NATO, would you accept that? And he says yes. And then that is ratified when Gorby announces his acceptance of this in July, at a time when, for the first time, representatives of the Warsaw Pact are invited to NATO meetings. And it is the end, the absolute end of the Cold War in Europe. It didn't have to happen this way. The American president was the midwife to this agreement. And it was possible, obviously Gorbachev is the one who did it in the end, but the circumstances had to be created such that this could happen successfully. And if you look at what his advisors are suggesting, they don't agree. I make the point in the book I remind people of how people debated in the year 2000 when they looked at the record of young George W. Bush. And there were a number of people who said, well, he doesn't know much about foreign policy, but it doesn't matter. Because look at his team. We've seen these people before. We know these people. They ran the government, the Foreign Policy Administration in their dad's time, and it was reasonably successful. But the truth is that it matters who the president is. We can, in this room, in this area, we can study this easily, because both Johnson and Kennedy had similar advisors, but many of the policy outcomes were different. The president, the character of the president, the preferences of the president mattered. The fact that it's George W. Bush who's with Cheney and Powell, and not George H.W. Bush, matters. What happened in the Daddy Bush administration was that you had a spectrum of opinion. On one end was Cheney. Cheney was a Gorbachev skeptic. He believed that Gorbachev would naturally fall and that it was in our interest to push him out. He believed that we had to work as fast and as hard as possible to break up the old Soviet Union. He assumed there would be pushback, and so it was important to pocket the games immediately. And on the other end, you had James Baker, who was a lawyer, who thought about international politics as lawyers do. He thought of working the deal, the art of the deal, finding negotiating a strategy, as a negotiation as the strategy. Scowcroft was sort of in the middle. He's a realist, looked at our national interest. He's the one who felt that we shouldn't move towards Gorby until we see some change in Eastern Europe. Daddy Bush was generally between Baker and Scowcroft, but could be on the other side too. He is the one who always made the big decisions. I can show you time and again, it's Bush who decides the outcome. And once the outcome is decided because of the amount of loyalty in that administration, it was followed. So here we have the success of Gorby. And what about the Gulf War? The Gulf War, the management of the Gulf War, shows the same kind of prudence. Prudence, of course, became a byword for his lack of vision. But in fact, I argue, prudence is a way of understanding the limits of American power. Remember where George Bush comes from. He is a child of the Roosevelt generation. He saw the role that alliances played in World War II. He saw that they played a useful role. Also, of course, he's UN ambassador. And as UN ambassador, makes a lot of allies among people who would later lead their own country or become foreign ministers of their countries. He knew a lot of people who mattered. So he had a sense of the importance of alliances. He also had an understanding, and this I think he got as much from Brent Scowcroft as he got from himself, that we were entering into a new era. And that new era might be able to adopt some of the principles that Franklin Roosevelt had espoused, but that the world could never accept because of the deep division between East and West that was clear by 1946. And those were principles not only about self-determination, but also about the inviolability of states, state sovereignty. And when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, that was a challenge to the New World Order, a term they used, unfortunately, at the time, that he was thinking about. So his reaction to the invasion of Kuwait was as much a way of showing leadership to define a new way of interacting in the international system as it was a way to slap down a petty tyrant named Saddam. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind, because he's not going to get the chance to get rid of Saddam. He's only going to get an opportunity to make a statement about international conduct of states. What's clear from his records is that Bush had two objectives after the invasion of Kuwait. One was, of course, to set the rules of the road for the new international system and liberate Kuwait. The second was to get rid of Saddam. George Bush is a much more emotional man than he ever let on. And he grew to detest Saddam. As evidence flowed to Washington of Saddam's atrocities in Kuwait, and by the way, many of these were wrong. They were actually created by the Kuwaitis to make us even more interested in helping them. But they affected George Bush. he starts to compare Saddam to Hitler, which is problematic for the United States. Because, of course, once you start comparing him to Hitler, if you don't get rid of him, then you haven't won. It changes the definition of victory. George Bush's rhetoric was so worrisome to his advisors that a man named Bob Gates, who is, of course, now SecDef, was asked by Scowcroft, he was Deputy National Security Advisor at the time, asked by Scowcroft to fly with George Daddy Bush to discourage him from making the Saddam equals Hitler analogy in 1990. But privately in his diary, Bush is talking about Saddam. And he begins to wonder whether the United States can hold together long enough to go to war with Saddam. And this is a part of the story that I haven't seen discussed elsewhere. But those of you who may have studied Franklin Roosevelt might know that even though there are conspiracy theories about Pearl Harbor that he knew in advance, well, he didn't know in advance. But that's not to say he didn't try to get us into war. But the war that Franklin Roosevelt wanted to get us into was a war with Germany, not Japan. Germany was always the main threat. And the way he tried to get us into war with Germany was by redefining the outer limit of the Coast Guard's patrols, to push them further and further into the Middle Atlantic so that they would get shot at by the Germans. George Bush tries to do the same thing in the fall of 1990. He is convinced that a large-scale air war would probably be enough to get rid of Saddam. He wants to kill him. I mean, he basically wants to blow him up. But how do you start an air war? Saddam held Americans hostage. He held diplomats. Anyway, what he did was he basically surrounded the American embassy in Kuwait City. We refused to close our embassy in Kuwait City and surrounded the embassy. Bush decided, and he went to the Pentagon and asked for plans to launch a rescue attempt of the American diplomats, knowing it would fail. Because then he could call in the Air Force and destroy Baghdad. He went to Margaret Thatcher with this idea. He went to Colin Powell with this idea. He went to James Baker with this idea. James Baker and Colin Powell got so nervous about this idea that they allied themselves together. Neither man wanted war. Powell and Baker did not want war of any kind in Kuwait to try to stop the president. And throughout the fall of 1990, Bush has to be restrained from this incident as strategy to bring the war on. Why? Was he losing his nerve? I wouldn't say that. It was Vietnam. Vietnam had traumatized Bush, as it did so many of his generation. He was afraid that the anti-war politics that had so poisoned the 1970s would reappear, and that before a ground war could be launched against Saddam, the American people would be divided. And so when it became clear that he couldn't have the incident, when he was talked out of it, he decided that the best thing would be to get congressional support for the war. It was his idea. Dick Cheney said it was wrong. Don't do it. You won't get it. It'll be a failure and we won't be able to go to war. Brent Scowcroft thought it was a bad idea to go to Congress. You didn't know, would Congress support it? You had a Democratic Congress. James Baker agreed with him. Bush said, we have to have it. If we are going to go into a ground war, given the horrors that our country experienced in Vietnam, the political, domestic, cultural, social horrors, we got to have a unified country. And so it was Bush's call to go and get that congressional support, which was not easy and involved a political risk. There's one other call that I want to mention before I get to the end of the war, which we all know something about. Another story that people never talk about, which I think reflects his coolness under tough conditions. A few weeks after the very first UN resolution, We're in August of 1990. The invasion happened at the very beginning of August. The resolution had no teeth. The UN was trying to prevent Iraq from trading and from acquiring weapons, but there are no teeth at all in this. U.S. intelligence notes 5 Iraqi tankers headed for Yemen with oil, obviously. There's a debate in the Bush administration. They violated the quarantine. U.S. Navy is there. We can easily bring them down. We can sink them all. Margaret Thatcher says, sink them. You must send a message to Saddam. He can't do this. James Baker, who is in Moscow at that time, says, no. Don't. If you do that without Soviet participation, you'll never get them to support a resolution at the United Nations in support of force against Saddam. If you truly want an alliance that includes the Soviets, thus bringing them from enemy to adversary to ally, you're going to have to hold your fire and swallow this one. There was a pitched discussion. Initially, Bush favored using force. And then he thought twice about it and realized that it would be incompatible with his general objectives in this war to lose the Soviets at the get-go, from the get-go. And so those tankers were allowed to go to Yemen. And Bush got a new UN resolution with teeth that allowed for the use of force against violations of the embargo. And that's the moment when Margaret Thatcher turned to George and said, don't go wobbly, George. It wasn't when Kuwait was invaded. It was when there was this issue over the tankers. Bush decided to let them go in search of a much broader objective, which he achieved. Of course, the most famous decision that he made was the decision not to go to Baghdad. I want to get rid of a few myths. There never was a debate in the administration over whether to go to Baghdad. There were no contingency plans about going to Baghdad. The issue was never about going to Baghdad. The debate was over how you remove Saddam. And here we see the seeds of the troubles of today. The Bush administration believed, the Daddy Bush administration believed that Iraq was ungovernable and that only a Sunni general, an authoritarian Sunni general, could govern Iraq. They were looking for a gray authoritarian to replace Saddam. Their thinking was that if Saddam sustained enough of a military defeat, if enough of his Republican guards were mauled, that would create this loss of face, which in the virile Middle East would lead to his fall and replacement by a gray Sunni general. Nobody was talking about democracy in Iraq. Nobody was talking about autonomy for the Kurds or more help for the Shia. They were looking for a Sunni to be as difficult to the Kurds and the Shia as Saddam, because what was our principal objective in that region? Containing Iran. And the fear was, if you took control from Baghdad and let the place fall apart, who would benefit? Iran. And in the discussion that occurred when the uprising started in the south and in Kurdistan, the discussion was, do we get involved in what would be a second Lebanon? These people had all been through the Lebanon disaster with Ronald Reagan, when we had sent a multinational force into Lebanon to try to keep the country together. And what was the outcome of that? 241 Marines were killed in 1983. They were bombed by a group called Hezbollah. In fact, the mastermind of that bombing was only killed a few months ago, Imad Mughniya. He was at large since 1983. The experience of Lebanon, which was a searing experience for the Reagan administration, prefigured the outcome of this discussion about whether to help the Shia or the Kurds. There was no way they were going to do it. Nobody talked about invading Baghdad. Nobody thought about occupying Iraq. That would have been totally inconsistent with the other major objective of this war, which was to establish new rules of the road in the international system. So Bush comes out of that war half satisfied. Privately, he's not elated. He writes in his diary, "I should be elated." Publicly, of course, it's described as a great victory. But for Bush, the fact that Saddam remained in power was a cross he had to bear. He wasn't seeking to make Iraq democratic. He was trying to get rid of a man he considered to be a threat to the entire region. So Bush's decisions on these major issues are all not only understandable, but I think in the light of experience, quite praiseworthy. I wanted to end with a little discussion of Lincoln, who, of course, has nothing to do with Bush. But it's worthwhile, now that we are thinking about what we expect from our presidents, that we ponder how our greatest president, I would argue, managed these kinds of issues. He was the greatest realist as president. In 1863, Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase wrote Lincoln to press him to extend the Emancipation Proclamation to certain parts of Virginia and Louisiana that had originally been exempted. Lincoln said no, and in so doing explained a theory of government that balanced power and principle. Quote, "The original proclamation has no constitutional or legal justification except as a military measure," he wrote to Chase in September of that year. "The exemptions were made because the military necessity did not apply to the exempted localities, nor does necessity apply to them now any more than it did then. If I take the step, must I not do so without the argument of military necessity, and so without any argument, except the one that I think the measure politically expedient and morally right? Would I not thus give up all footing upon constitution or law? Would I not thus be in the boundless field of absolutism?" Think of that, boundless field of absolutism. Could this pass unnoticed or unresisted? Bush was no Lincoln. But like our greatest foreign policy presidents, Bush understood that limits do exist. He understood that legitimacy and coalitions could be force multipliers. That America, like presidents, cannot go it alone. This is not dewy-eyed idealism. This is the hard-headed realism that led Truman, Marshall, and Atchison to create NATO, that convinced John F. Kennedy not to use force and to involve the OAS in the blockade during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that led to Nixon and Kissinger's triangular diplomacy in the 1970s, and Reagan and George Shultz's pocketing of gains in 1987 and 88. Americans are generally reluctant realists. Making choices based on assessment of power and recognizing limits is difficult for leaders of a country with a revolutionary heritage, an exceptionalist streak, and boundless optimism bred in the bone. The foreign policy leader who applied realism with the most gusto, Henry Kissinger, saw himself more as the product of the European tradition of statecraft than of what some would call our American soulcraft. The elder George Bush did not relish saying wait to the Lithuanians or no to the Iraqi Shia. He was not happy that Saddam had defied predictions and stayed in power, and he had hoped at home that the flexible freeze — I haven't talked at all about the budget issue, where he also showed some courage — might work. But when push came to shove, he made decisions based on larger considerations of national interest within a broader strategic calculus that tied ends to means. Most great American realists are reluctant, and that doesn't make them any less great when they also happen to be our president. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm sure there are going to be quite a few questions. You covered a great deal of material about President Bush. The one thing I just need to have the critical comment is you haven't picked up his speech cadence. My friends from the Bush School have all been taught he's Saddam, and you keep saying Saddam. So,
well, I wasn't quoting, but no. Then that would become a parody.
Fair enough. Anyway, Frank, please.
Tim, thank you for a fascinating talk. about the dilemmas a realist president faces in a democracy. And it's something I struggle with all the time when I'm trying to teach these issues. Here we have you very convincingly laying out someone who pursued a very realistic foreign policy, and one I'm fairly sympathetic with, at least its broad outlines. Yet it just falls flat with the American people, where it's not convincing during an election cycle. And I wonder what your reflections are about this. I mean, this is, again, I remember from our days in the Miller Center, the sort of difference between the Ted Sorensen Kennedy and the realist Kennedy, right? The Ted Sorensen Kennedy with this wonderful prose that people love that had absolutely nothing to do with how he governed. And so how do you think about that in a sort of democracy? So there seems to be a temptation to do the Kennedy thing, to say one thing and do another, but that's kind of problematic. So that would be the one question, what your thoughts are about that. And related to that is, why, after having such an arguably masterful foreign policy, did he run such a disastrous campaign?
Okay.
It is one of the worst run campaigns ever. Some people have argued, been involved in that he really didn't want to be reelected. And I want to hear your view on that. He didn't want it enough. But what happened in the summer of 1992?
Oh wow. Well, the first thing is, and I forgot to mention this. As you know, the views, it should be clear from what I've said, are not my views are not the views of the United States government and not the National Archives, and I'm a presidential library director, but I have a, how should I put this? I think part of the problem lies in the concept of the presidency. Let me unpack this for you. The president is an 18th century creation that I think doesn't make sense in the 21st century. If you think about other countries, I believe, and I have to be careful, but I think we're the only democracy in the world where our leader is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, head of government, and head of state. Those are three different skill sets. Bush was a very good head of government, terrible head of state, and I think successful commander-in-chief. Ronald Reagan was a brilliant head of state. Not such a good head of government if you really look at what the government achieved, and he didn't have to be commander-in-chief. In fact, the few efforts were laughable. I mean, Grenada. Americans seem to vote for heads of state more than they do for heads of government. We don't have a prime ministerial system. If I can be discursive for a moment, I find it funny and yet and interesting that so many people watch Question Time on C-SPAN. Why? I would love it. I have to say, full disclosure now, I was born in Canada. I mean, I know parliamentary systems. I grew up in one. They require different kinds of leaders. They require leaders who are a little bit more wonkish. These people don't have to be as popular. They're also constructing parties, and they win their party, and then their party wins the election. Not so much that they win the election, although personality does matter, but they can be far wonkier and succeed. They're also tested in a way that maybe only Barack and Hillary are tested because they've had 58 debates, but they're tested all the time. So I don't think that being a good head of government means very much. And Frank and I have had this discussion. It's not debate. We both agree with this. Presidents really don't influence the economy all that much. There are some big decisions, and he's the country's best, certainly, on those, monetary policy and stuff like that. So ask Frank. But frankly, most of what happens is outside a president's ken. And when they say, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" That's just baloney. I mean, they might be lucky that you are, but it's not because of anything they did. So I don't think there is much linkage between a person's ability to run the government and whether they're electable or not. So I think that's how you explain it. Now the campaign of '92. Oh my goodness. In this, it's what was fun about doing this book is I was writing about a period I lived through. Most of the time I write about periods I wasn't alive in, or if I was in diapers. And so again, I was trying to remember how I saw it compared to how it looks in light of history, and it's not always the same, by the way. Bush looked like the inevitable, that his reelection was soda, completely set. And the evidence of that is that no major Democrats wanted to run against him. The real heavyweights, the Hamlet, for example, the Hamlet of the Democratic Party was a guy named Mario Cuomo. Am I going to run? Am I not going to run? Am I going to run? Well, he didn't run, right? So you had all these candidates, all the good ones, left, and then there was this guy from Arkansas. Well, nobody from Arkansas had ever been president before, but he saw he had a chance. And by the way, this guy from Arkansas was almost as politically dead as Richard Nixon was in 1962 after he gave this horrible speech in the 1988 convention. That's a speech that's every speaker's nightmare when you say, and in conclusion, and people start to applaud. That was Bill Clinton's experience. Anyway, so the 92 election should have been his. And in the fall of 91, the campaign produced a series of ads about the Gulf War and about the end of the Cold War and Bush's role. Exactly what we're basically arguing, which is, hey, he should have run on that. And then something happened in Pennsylvania. A guy named Dick Thornburgh ran in Pennsylvania. And it was a special election for the Senate. And he ran on Bush's foreign policy. And he lost. He was the Attorney General of the United States. He lost. And Bush's advisors got scared. We can't run on foreign policy. At the same time, we went through what turned out to be shallow and short, but it was a recession. And unemployment rose quite quickly in 91. So people were beginning to think about the economy. Foreign policy wasn't selling as much. And there was one last element, before I talk about Bush himself, that was important. A guy named Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater was the Karl Rove, though less schooled than Karl Rove of the Daddy Bush era. He died of a brain tumor. He was the mastermind of Bush's comeback in the primaries. I didn't even go into that, but the reason he says, read my lips, no new taxes, was that he was going to lose New Hampshire. People think of it as something he said at the convention. He did. That's when Peggy Noonan writes a speech and he says it. But he had actually made that pledge in New Hampshire to beat Bob Dole, because Bob Dole was coming on strong. And actually, I interviewed Bob Dole for the library, and he says to this day that 88 was his year, not 96. He never thought he would win in 96, but 88 was his year. And Bush realized the only way to beat Bob Dole was to basically ally himself with supply-siders and to embrace Reagan's tax policy. So anyway, the point is that the team that existed for 88 that had helped him come back was gone. Sununu had played an important role in the 88 campaign. Sununu had gotten into trouble and was fired as chief of staff. He's out of the picture. Lee Atwater is dead. And so the campaign is run by three people. Oh, and the last element, James Baker. James Baker had been Bush's campaign manager from 1970 on. In 1992, he was Secretary of State. And he was working on the Madrid Conference, which turned out to be a very useful conference, shaped Middle Eastern politics, led to some major peace treaties. He didn't want to stop working on foreign policy. He was not interested in returning to domestic affairs. George Bush had to convince him, and he only came reluctantly and never became formally campaign manager when he became White House Chief of Staff again in September of 92. So the team that had worked with Bush is gone. The economy begins to matter. Bush's advisors on the economic side are all telling him it's going to be shallow and short. They were right, by the way. The problem was the public didn't understand. They were still suffering, but at the time they went to the polls. And now the personality side of it. George Bush is not well in 1991-92. His energy level begins to drop. He has this thyroid problem, which hits him starting in the spring of 91. And they can't figure out the medication. You know, one of the things we don't do very well as presidential historians is figure out the role of not only psychology but also physiology. I'm convinced, for example, that the way to understand Dick Cheney and the way he's changed is that the man has arteriosclerosis. My dad, unfortunately, died of that, and I saw a change in his character over time. I mean, it affects your mind. I mean, it unfortunately does. I mean, we don't like to do this. We're always assuming that individuals are the same until they get very sick at the end and die, but they change. And Bush is not the same man. First of all, he's beginning to feel old. He doesn't have the energy. Bush always had more energy than anybody else. When he was running, in his 50s, in his early 60s, he begins to feel his age when he gets to be 67 because of the thyroid problem. That's the first. And the second is Ross Perot. Ross Perot hits Bush in the solar plexus. Perot is somebody he's known for years. He's a Texan. He's known this guy for years. And Bush is pissed at him. And I know this because I looked at, and they're open, I looked at what Bush tells Richard Nixon in the 92 campaign. And Richard Nixon is amazed at how obsessed Bush is with Ross Perot. How he can't believe, he thinks Perot is going to explode and go away. Like, he hates Perot. And the Perot factor shouldn't be underestimated. That Bush, rather than looking at Clinton and focusing on Clinton, he's focused on Perot. Because Perot is this traitor. And there's a little backstory that's phenomenal about Perot. Reagan asks, Perot is consistently interested in the POW issue, MIA issue, and he's convinced that they're alive in Vietnam. I don't know if he is anymore, but he certainly was then. The Reagan administration thought it drove him crazy, just crazy, trying to deal with Perot. And so they pawned it off on George Bush, Vice President Bush. And so Vice President Bush used to have to meet with Perot. And it's Vice President Bush who told Perot that he could not become, I think he wanted to be special advisor to the National Security Council on POWs. And Perot never forgave him and held Bush responsible for this when in fact it was a decision made by, it was a decision made by President Reagan. So those are the factors. Sorry, long answer, but great question. Thanks, Frank.
Go ahead, Jack.
Dr. Naftali, thank you so much. You're showing an awesome command of the detail here, and I would also compliment you on your comments from JFK, a presidency revealed, which I saw in May 2003, which discussed the health problems of John Kennedy in the context of the kinds of things that you're talking about with respect to the medical issues as well. I agree with your main thrust as far as the successful foreign policy and especially diplomacy of the Bush 41 administration. Within that, I disagree with the sense of inevitability about 1989 and the democratic revolutions in Eastern Europe because of the counterexample of China and Tiananmen Square, for example.
No, I do disagree that we felt it was inevitable, or I didn't argue that it was inevitable. I said we all felt it was at the time, but in retrospect, it wasn't.
I don't think that we did feel it was inevitable after the June massacre in Tiananmen Square. And I know that the Funkenwagels annual after that had the photograph of the Chinese fellow in front of the tank, rather than the people standing on the Berlin Wall. So that would be the counterexample. What I wanted to ask you about is the soft touch, though, toward the USSR, and put forward the hypothesis that even though it wound up being successful with respect to the reluctant realism that Bush pursued with respect to Iraq, that perhaps it didn't turn out so well with respect to the emerging conflict in the Balkans with the breakup of Yugoslavia.
Yep.
And if I can just develop...
Go ahead. Sure. No, I agree with you.
Half a minute here. The emerging conflict there was pretty much left alone or left to the Europeans by the Bush people, And there was some logic in that, although it was way too early to expect the Europeans to get any kind of military response together, which was obviously what was needed against Milosevic. But in addition to that, the festering conflict there abetted the Muslim militancy that we saw develop into the 21st century problems that we have been facing. And I was just wondering how you would put your thesis into some kind of embrace of the Balkan situation.
Oh, well, I agree with you. I mean, the administration mishandled the Baltic issue, and when you a Balkan issue.
And was Yugoslavia the last proxy war in the Cold War, even though it post?
Well, no, that would be the first. No, because then we're still fighting the Russians that way in Kosovo. So I don't think it's the last of anything. I think it's actually the first. Larry Eagleberger had been U.S. ambassador to Yugoslavia. Brent Scowcroft knows Serbo-Croatian. They both agree that, in retrospect, that they made a mistake, that they mishandled this, that they turned their head and let the Europeans deal with it. And of course, what the Germans did is they recognized Croatia, and they recognized Slovenia, and that set in motion this. And Bush's only real initiative was a speech that's remembered for a different reason. It's something called the Chicken Kiev speech, which he gives in the Ukraine. The speech was not designed to tell the Ukrainians to stay Soviet. The speech was actually designed to tell Yugoslavia that that independence doesn't always mean democracy and freedom. Now, of course, it was mishandled, wasn't given very well, and Bush, of course, is never noted for his speeches, except this one made him look bad. But there was a debate in the administration over what to do about Sarajevo. And they decided to do nothing because of the fear of casualties. Nobody's mentioned the other mistake, which is Somalia, which was supposed to be an quick in and out operation to basically to make it possible for food to be delivered, because the gangs, most famous was Aidid, they were holding up the delivery of food by the UN. The Pakistanis were requesting assistance, and George Bush wanted to do something that was humanitarian in his last weeks in office. And the Clinton administration was told when they came in that this is supposed to last only 3 weeks. Sorry, couldn't get it done by January 20th, but it's going to be over by February. Don't you worry about it. Okay, quick in and quick out, which of course was not true. So this was not a perfect administration. We also didn't talk about Panama. Again, that was another miscue in 1989 when the coup occurs in Panama and they mishandle it. That was their Bay of Pigs. That's when they realized that for all the experience around the table, they really hadn't gelled as a National Security Council. And they learned a lot from that, the failed coup of October 1989, and that's what makes possible the operation later that year in Panama. So this is not a perfect administration. I fairly rarely find perfect administrations except for the Johnson administration. And I, if I were at the Kennedy Library, anyway, I wouldn't say that at the Nixon Library, but that's a different story. But I mean, you see, I have a lower expectation from presidents. I think greatness is very rare in American history. And I think Bush made some great decisions, and I think he deserves great credit for those. And they're really world historical decisions. He made some mistakes. There's no question about it. His at least one choice for the Supreme Court was not terribly strong. I mean, if you want to look into his administration, you can find errors. But I think we have an unreasonable expectation about our presidents. and I think it's more interesting to see when they actually do something really good and not assume that they will. And Bush is surprised. I mean, I think he gets 3 biggies right. And the third one we didn't go into is the handling of the budget and S&L crises. I mean, he really handles the S&L crisis very, very well. I don't go into it with you today, but just look at it. I'm going to talk about it in the book. He did remarkably well. And I would argue and do that though Clinton will go further, Robert Rubin will go further on handling American policy in supporting U.S.-Canada free trade, in getting the wheels in motion for NAFTA, in beginning the process of fiscal responsibility in our country. The Bush administration lays the groundwork for what would be the Clinton prosperity of the 90s. Now, Clinton deserves most of the credit, but it's a Republican administration that lays the groundwork. I also use the term cleaning up Reagan's mess. If Bush had not cleaned up these messes which Ronald Reagan had left, I think the Reagan legacy would be far less interesting to Republicans than it is. I think there's a lot of the Reagan legacy that Republican admirers of the president have forgotten. And it's Bush who's more than an asterisk. He does a lot to clean up the situation and help 2 presidents, the one before and the one after, to be iconic. Bill.
Could you say something about the importance of Bush's preparation for foreign policy before he became president? You demonstrated the self-confidence that he showed in overruling or countering his advisors. How much of that came from the fact that he had been doing foreign policy in important capacities for 20 years?
Bill, a lot of it came from, and I've been thinking about this a lot because the campaign right now is about experience. The 3 o'clock in the morning, the telephone call? By the way, let me tell you, I don't want a president who makes a decision at 3 o'clock in the morning. Only in the Cold War, when the balloon's down and the missiles are coming your way, did presidents have to make split-second decisions? That era is over. So no president is going to make a decision at 3 o'clock in the morning alone that's going to matter, frankly. So that was completely bogus. But there's the question of what is the experience that matters? And I've thought a lot about this, and let me just share a few points with you. No one, with a few exceptions, and I'd like to go into those in a minute, has had the experience to be president. Being senator is not the same. Bob Dole tells the story that if you say, Mr. President, in the Senate cloakroom, 99 heads turn. Senators have no experience running anything except their mouths. So senators don't have experience, and we're going to have a senator elected. Well, when was the last time we had a senator elected? And he had a hard time in the beginning. Even his most admiring biographer, Arthur Schlesinger, describes Kennedy as learning in the job. Okay, so senators are always going to screw up in the beginning, and I don't care what they do. So which are the ones that have had really interesting experience? They're people who've run things, big things, and have had to make tough calls. Dwight Eisenhower, D-Day. Lyndon Johnson. Yeah, he was a senator, but he also ran the Senate. He ran the legislative process, which I think shapes the way he becomes president, because he's actually big head of government. He's another person who's a great head of government, not such a great head of state. So it's people who run things. And George Bush, it's not that he'd really run much of anything, but he had interacted with foreign leaders. He saw foreign policy as a Rolodex. He would reach out and talk to foreign leaders, and he felt he knew them. He is a great listener. He has control over his ego. He doesn't pontificate. I think that shaped him. Now, I'm not saying that meant that he knew how to move legislation. He didn't. His administration's legislative record is pretty weak. He didn't know how to garner support in the country. His big risk was the congressional resolution, which he won, but it was a tough call. It was a close call. But what he did understand was other foreign leaders. And so his background in China, his background because he was our representative in China at the UN, those served him very well. And politically, running the RNC. He does something remarkable. He runs the RNC during Watergate and comes out of it unscathed. And his final achievement, DCI. He's not in the CIA long enough to matter. He doesn't matter for the history of the CIA, except in one respect. He restored their morale after years of investigations. The effect of the CIA on him is much greater than his effect on the CIA. He is among a handful of presidents who truly understood the limits of intelligence. He didn't come into office thinking the CIA could do it all. You've had presidents, for example, who exaggerate the power of the CIA. Nixon did, but in a negative way. He hated the CIA. He saw it everywhere. But that's a different story. Come to the library, you'll see soon. Other presidents know nothing about the CIA, so they come into power and they're lured into believing that it has these powers and abilities. John F. Kennedy is a perfect example of someone who didn't understand the limits of this. Bush understood the strengths and weaknesses of the CIA. He used intelligence very successfully. That, again, was a product of his resume. So, yeah, I think in many ways, the weird experience he had, the fact that he couldn't win elections and therefore to keep in the public eye kept accepting these federal jobs, turned out to be very useful to him once he was in office. I wanted to make one other point about our presidential system. I don't know when it started. Bill would probably know. But at a certain point, presidents began to believe that they had to be reelected in order to be vindicated in history. I think some of them should look to James Polk as their model. Sometimes a one-term president is good enough. If George Bush had retired, he would have been remembered at the time as a very good president. By running for office, all of the weaknesses of his candidacy, all of those things I was talking to, when Frank and I were talking about, became apparent and were the last images of him. He's lucky his son ran for office, became a bad president, and now we're revisiting the good, but that was not inevitable. So he was a perfect one-term president. My suspicion is that if McCain is elected, given his age, if he's smart, he will be a one-term president.
You should announce ahead of time.
Yeah, that is. Well, the only problem with that, Bill, is that people are so nasty in Washington that you become a lame duck by. Well, but I think maybe. Well, but there may be, that might matter that we're talking about 160 years later. But I think you'd be a lame duck. But I think if you think of your legacy as a one-termer, Bush was a perfect one-term president.
So we've come pretty much to the end of our time. I would point out, Tim and I were at Starbucks before we came to this talk, and we got into a conversation about what you should compare presidents to with the woman who sold us our coffee in order to establish whether they're a good president or not. And we established that you could set some very low standards and compare a president favorably to them. And if Polk is your standard for a great president, I'm not sure I would want to sign up to join this country, especially.
Oh no, Polk was a
okay.
But no, everything. No, listen.
We should not have a discussion of James K. Polk right now. But
why not? But no, we can have a whole. No, that well.
But
remember Polk.
Okay. We will have a long conversation about Polk later, but for now, I think we can thank Tim for helping resuscitate George H.W. Bush, who I think is a decidedly better president. And I would like to thank all of you for coming and remind you that the Strauss Center has lots of great events. Go to their website and check them out, but especially the last one in this series is with Philip Zelikow next Thursday night. I look forward to seeing you. Have a great night.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Eugene.
Absolutely.